This is the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. The book is Edgar Allan Poe, A Life, the author Richard Copley. It's the most comprehensive and critical biography of Poe yet produced, exploring his fascinating life, his extraordinary work, and the vital relationship between the two. Richard Copley, Distinguished Professor of English, Emeritus, Penn State DuBois, has written and edited books that focus on 19th century American literature with particular attention to Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne. They are accessible and revealing works of analysis and discovery. Happy to have Richard Copley join me now for the first time here on the Speaking of Writers podcast. Richard, welcome.
Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
So, why this book on Poe for you, and what was your goal or multiple goals going in?
I began to work on Poe as a graduate student. I wanted an adventure, and I thought, this fellow is mysterious, and perhaps I can figure something out. I was working with Leslie Fiedler, and I started with his novel, Arthur Gordon Pym, went on to the detective stories, and he was always fabulous. I always had a great time trying to work out his mysteries. What happened was in the early 90s, I bought a collection sight unseen of I knew not what, which it turned out were letters from the stepdaughter of Poe's best friend about Poe. And they told stories about Poe that no one knows. And so I began to think, well, perhaps I should do a biography with these letters as support, telling new stories about Edgar Allan Poe and providing as well my interpretations of his work. So in 2012, I really got to work on those letters. I had put them away while I was in the midst of my career, but I took them out, transcribed them, and in 2016, I had a contract with the University of Virginia Press, and I worked on that book for 8 years, and it came out in March, and I'm delighted with it.
Were you always a fan of Poe, and can you remember your very first experience reading Poe?
Well, I was a fan of Poe just like most kids are fans of Poe's. I remember reading The Gold Bug one afternoon when I was homesick, and I thought it was just unbelievable.
Hmm.
Hidden treasure and pirates and secret writing. It was just fabulous. I remember in ninth grade reading The Fall of the House of Usher, and my thought was, who is this guy who can use a word like phantasmagorical?
Hmm.
So I was taken with him, but we were all, most of us, taken with him. What happened was that in graduate school, I was about 28. I began to reread him and then read new works by him, including the novel, and I became newly fascinated and focused on trying to solve the problems of his literary mysteries.
There's a lot to unpack with Edgar Allan
Yes,
Poe,
yes,
and you do
exactly.
it chronologically in this book.
That's right.
What was his life like growing up, Richard?
He lost his parents. He was an orphan.
Hmm.
His father had abandoned the family and died. His mother, who was a talented actress, became sick, probably with tuberculosis. She died, and he was taken in by a woman who was devoted to him, but her husband was not. Things went well at first, and then they didn't. The foster father's name was John Allan, and he was increasingly resentful of his foster son. And I'm sure Edgar was a difficult boy to manage, but it seems that John Allan's only approach was severity and threats and punishment, and they did not work. So it was increasingly an unhappy childhood, but he did find relief in the mother of a friend of his who was his guide and his solace. Her name was Jane Stith Stannard, and he wrote poems in honor of her. To Helen is the most famous. So it was a difficult childhood, but he did have consolation. He also did have friends who admired him and respected him, and he felt part of a community, which is, I think, something we have lost about Poe, that he was a part of a community of friends who were devoted to him, sometimes even loved him. And that lasted through his life, through his 40 years.
In his young life, he withdraws from the University of Virginia. He gets court-martialed out of West Point, so he's 19 now, Richard. And what does he do?
This all has to do with the inadequate support provided by John Allan. And at West Point, Poe realized he was never going to win back John Allan's affection. And he had been going to West Point in part to please his foster father. So he simply gave up and he deliberately had himself court-martialed. What he did, he confronted John Allan. He was rebuffed. He was taken in by his good friend John H. Mackenzie in Richmond. And after some recovery, he decided to go to Baltimore. We had family, and he lived with his aunt and his cousin. And it was over the years in Baltimore, 1831 to 1835, that he began to have affection for his cousin and in time love for her. And eventually he and Virginia married in 1836. So this was the beginning of his bouncing back. He became editor of a major literary magazine in Richmond, and he was beginning to make a name for himself, even nationally. So it was a period of recovery, those early years in Baltimore, and he was able to rise again.
He marries Virginia, but she dies very young at the age
Yes,
of 24.
right.
How does he react to that, and what does he do after that?
Well, they married when she was 13, and that is 36, and she dies in 47. So they had 11 years, and they were they had a happy marriage, as far as I can tell. In fact, his friend John H. Mackenzie said that Poe's love for Virginia was the best thing about him. He was utterly devoted to his wife, and when she died, as you say, after a long illness, he was he was a wreck. He was tremendously overwrought, and he would go to her. He would go to her grave in the middle of the night. He was in terrible shape, and in fact, he never really fully recovered from her death. He tried, and he did manage to have a few more literary achievements and give fabulous talks and regain and expand his eminence. But in at his core, I think he was without solace at the loss of his wife.
And he always had his writing. Was it
He
cathartic
did.
for him?
It was. He did not write when he was anything but totally sober and in control. And he was a master of the language, of the form, of the theme, of the allusion. He was tremendously accomplished in various genres. And that was a matter of pride for him, that it wasn't just the horror story. He invented, after all, the detective story. He could write romantic poems. He could write, a cosmology. He was, and he was the greatest critic of his age. And yes, it was a consolation for him to return to this area where he was great and able to have the control that he didn't sometimes have otherwise, especially with his difficulty with alcohol.
I know you wanted to in this book connect the life with the work, the horror genre. How did he get into that, and why?
Well, at the time when he was a young man, the eminent journal was Blackwood's Edinburgh Magazine, and his foster father he was an import-export person. He carried some of these magazines, and Poe would go to the warehouse and he would read these magazines. So as a young man, he saw some of these great tales of horror in Blackwood's, and he loved them, and he decided to go them one better, so that when we think of tales of horror, we think of Poe before we think of Blackwood.
Hmm.
Now, when it was said by some critic that his tales of horror were too Germanic, He said, my terror is not of Germany, but of the soul. So he was bringing to bear, whether he would reveal it or not, the suffering he had been through, the agony, the fears, the torments in these stories. And I think that's part of why they have such resonance for us, because they were so heartfelt by him.
As part of your research, Richard, you got access to the private letters of Flora Lapham Mack. Who was Flora Lapham Mack?
Well, Flora was, that was my question too at the beginning. Eventually, it became clear. She was the stepdaughter of Poe's best friend, John H. Mackenzie. Her mother was Mackenzie's wife's cousin. So she knew John H. Mackenzie from her childhood. And eventually, of course, after his wife had died and her father had died, Mackenzie married her mother, making Flora the stepdaughter. But she knew these stories of Poe all her life, and she was fascinated by them. And she would go around to the different members of the Mackenzie family. Tell me your stories about Edgar Allan Poe. Tell me yours. Tell me yours. So eventually what happened is a distant relative wrote to her asking for her stories about Poe for the biography he proposed to write. And so she wrote a series of letters in 1908, 1909, telling her stories. Now, this fellow received the letters, wrote the biography, but was unhappy with it and destroyed the biography. But he protected the letters. Some of those letters are at the Poe Museum, and some of those letters are the ones I bought back in 1992. And they tell the stories that are otherwise unknown. Now, perhaps they would be known, some of them anyway, but the big collection of Poe materials, first editions, letters, manuscripts that were gathered by John H. Mackenzie's brother Tom for the biography he would write, and which he did write, were destroyed in the evacuation fire in Richmond on April 3rd, 1865. A world of information about Poe from those who loved him best, the Mackenzies, were gone. But these letters from Flora conveyed that world, and those letters are the key to my providing that world in my book.
Your central argument is as out of control as Poe's life could sometimes be, his literary work was utterly in control. He was always in control of that.
It's true. He was able to write with with a deftness and a emotion that connected with the regular reader. I mean, he had to win the ordinary reader of the Messenger, of Graham's, of Burton's. But at the same time, he was able to write something more complicated that the regular reader could seek if he or she wished to, but didn't need to. And you could say the same of Hawthorne, and you could say the same of Melville. They were writing for the many and the few. And one of the joys of Poe is trying to figure out the allegory, the allusion, the hidden form, the elements that were not immediately accessible to his contemporary readership, but that can be accessed, especially for us who are the beneficiary of years of criticism and interpretation and biography. And that's something that I tried hard to accomplish in the biography, to bring the work to life, not only in terms of its immediate emotional impact, but in terms of its covert complexity.
Richard, what do you think his legacy is?
I think, people oftentimes think first of the tales of terror. Some might think first of the detective story genre that he invented. But at the heart, I think the story is a story of suffering overcome, which I find very compelling, and I think many others do too. He had so many difficulties, from his foster father to his poverty to his alcoholism to the deaths of those who were close to him, and yet he would recover to the degree that he would be able to write The Raven, Ululu, Eleonora, The Cask of Amontillado, Telltale Heart. Over and over again, he came back from a dark time and created something that has radiated our lives and will continue to for I'm sure centuries to come. So at its heart, I think the legacy is of overcoming, of triumphing over grave difficulties until, of course, he couldn't.
And Richard, when readers finish the last page of this biography, what would you like them to take away?
I'd like them to take away the idea that he was a decent person who was struggling. He was a worthy person who was respected and beloved in his time. And his work is worthy of our investigation, and his life, troubled as it is worthy of our admiration and our fellow feeling.
And what is next for you in your writing?
Well, I'm doing short pieces about Poe, and what I'm hoping and expecting is that next year I get back to doing my own fiction. And I've recently finished an alphabet book, so I'm beginning to find my way to my own fiction and poetry. And I'll never let go of Poe, of course, nor will he let go of me. But
Yeah.
I'll be doing more of my own creative work.
He's Richard Kopley. He's got a website, by the way, richardkopley.com. You can get updates on his future work, too. It is spelled Kopley. This book is out now. It is terrific. Edgar Allan Poe, A Life. It's on University of Virginia Press, and the author is Richard Kopley. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Steve. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
And this is the Speaking of Writers podcast. Thanks for watching. I'm Steve Richards.